Thank you, Maika, for that introduction, and thank you all for showing up. I know that I'm up against David Drummond in the other room, so it's actually, I'm really grateful and appreciative that you're all here for this talk, because I really only expected about 5 people that I knew to be in the room, so thank you for that. My name's Cynthia Owyoung, and I am the founder and CEO of Breaking Glass Forums. And what we're all about, my mission, is to change the face of corporate leadership today to be more diverse and inclusive. And I do that by accelerating diverse leadership and creating more inclusive organizations. I've been doing this work for almost 15 years at different tech companies here in the Valley. And in that time, I've had the opportunity to really experiment with a lot of things, make some mistakes, see what works, what doesn't work. And what I'm going to talk to you today is share some of those examples and hopefully give you some lessons learned that you can take back into your companies to really drive more innovative ways of addressing diversity and inclusion where you are as well. So I can't talk about diversity and inclusion without first talking about who I am and why I care so much about this work. So this is a photo of my family. I am the daughter of immigrants who came here from China with nothing and settled in the Hunters Point Bayview district of San Francisco. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with that area, it is a low-income, primarily African-American neighborhood. So I like to tell people that I'm actually tri-cultural because I have the Chinese heritage, the white majority America culture, and a huge affinity to the African-American culture as well. I also have a brother, and he's the one standing next to me, who is developmentally challenged, and the brother standing next to him is gay. I'm a mother of children, of which one you see in this photo. Wife to a wonderful husband, raised in the Buddhist tradition, and my father is actually an Air Force veteran. So what I like to tell people is that I have all the protected classes covered in my immediate family. And that is what gives me incredible empathy in this work. I have a very sharpened sense of what it's like to be a person who is discounted, who is feeling like they're part of a marginalized community, who feels less than. And I take that into the work that I do because it's helped me really have a sharpened sense of correcting inequalities and creating access to opportunities for everyone. So now that I've told you why this work matters to me, let's get into some examples of things that I've done that didn't work in my past that hopefully you'll take some lessons learned from. So at my very first diversity and inclusion role, I was told to put together a diversity and inclusion strategy for the company. And like every good strategy, you have to start with the business case. And so I did all my due diligence, I got the data, I did my needs assessment, I looked at all the research and gathered that all together in this beautiful, like 20-page PowerPoint. And then I sat there and I presented to the senior leaders around what the strategy and the business case should be. And then I found myself actually getting into a debate around the data, like questions around where did the data come from? Is that an accurate snapshot of where we are today? Is the research that you're pulling up really recent and relevant to what our business is about? And it was kind of this weird, like, infinite loop of I would go back, get more research, get more data, come back and still have these conversations. So it clearly wasn't working in driving people to action. What I realized from these conversations is that I needed to do something different. So fast forward, I actually tell people to throw out the business case. Now, I'm not saying don't do it, okay? They are useful. You have to come to the table with data in order to be heard by your executives. But the reality is if you don't connect with them emotionally, beyond just their minds and really connect with their hearts in some way, you're not going to drive them to action. And so the last diversity strategy I presented, I actually brought in very personal experiences and stories about what it's like to experience discrimination and prejudice. And by the time I was done, 2 people in the room were in tears. And that's when I knew those are people that I can leverage to really drive change across this organization. So my advice to you is to figure out what are those personal stories and really connect not only to people's minds, but to their hearts as well when you talk about the business case for diversity and inclusion. At one of the companies that I worked for, we had a diversity day. So this is a day when all of the employee resource groups actually had like cultural celebrations. They had booths to talk about their culture and their history. It was really a fantastic day to help educate the rest of the company around what employee resource groups were all about. But what I found was that it wasn't really moving the needle. We were having a great time, but we weren't changing our numbers around hiring and retention of people from underrepresented groups. So I fast forward to my next company. I actually ended up working for one of the most hard-nosed business people ever, who taught me how to be a business leader and not just a diversity leader. And she basically asked me the question, what is the impact of our employee resource groups? How are they really affecting the business? And so in that conversation, I realized that if I didn't turn it around, we were not going to get funding for the employee resource groups next year, which meant treating our ERGs as business units. So requiring them to put a business plan together, to set goals, to be held accountable to those goals and monitor progress around metrics. And we asked the employee resource group leaders to have conversations with their managers so that they weren't seeing their work as volunteer extracurricular activities, that it was integrated into their professional development plans, so it wasn't your second day job, right? And this really turned things around. We had our women's ERG really drive change across the organization. They improved our hiring numbers, they improved our retention numbers, and we got more funding as a result. The last example that I'll share with you is a more recent example. I was at a company where I really wanted to implement the Rooney Rule. And so for those of you who don't know the Rooney Rule, it's requiring a diverse slate of candidates for roles that you're interviewing for. And so we did this with executive search firms for executive level positions that we were recruiting for. But I was finding that we were still hiring mostly white males. So the Rooney Rule wasn't making a huge difference for me, and I had to step back and really understand what was going on. And what I realized in this process was that I hadn't addressed the underlying biases and structural processes and cultural beliefs that were driving the results that we were getting. So when I shifted that thinking at my next company, we really wanted to focus instead on how do you drive diversity and inclusion as cultural transformation, right? It's truly a change initiative that requires a lot of work. You're not going to get real huge change across this industry by focusing on individual programs. And so if you take the hiring process as an example, it's looking at job descriptions and revamping those. It's looking at your interview teams and seeing how diverse they are. It's looking at the questions you ask around culture fit and revamping those to really find people who are adding to the inclusive environment that you're trying to create. So soup to nuts, what are the processes? What are the beliefs and behaviors that are driving the results that you're getting? And really redefining all of that with your leaders is what's important. And that's what's going to help you drive change. So when I was putting this talk together, I actually was thinking, are these really innovations? I mean, these are really like spectacular failures on my part, but you know, could we really label these as new ways of thinking? And kind of what I realized is that if nobody's really doing it, and there are very few companies that do these 3 things that I just outlined for you, then it is new and it is innovative. And so I would encourage you all to really go back to your companies and think about how do you build emotional connection to this work to drive people to action. How can you make sure that D&I is relevant to the business in a way that really builds the business and addresses the business priorities? And what is your role and that of your leader's role in driving cultural change across the organization? So there's a lot more failures where that came from. I'm happy to share them with you. If you have questions afterwards, please connect with me on social media. And thank you so much for your time.
Great. Anyone has any questions? It shows that you had lunch and now people are ready to participate.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Tali. My question for you is about your second point, making ERGs a business unit. So my company is really happy to have these affinity groups, as we call them, and support people who are putting work into them. But what I find is that it takes away from people who are working on that, lose time on actually doing their real work. And I'm in a rotational program where a big component of it is learning. So the more time I put into events for women in tech or whatever it is that I'm working on, the less time I have to actually build my skills in my job. And obviously I care about these diversity and inclusion initiatives, but I also need to grow within the work I do that I'm getting paid for. So how do you reconcile those?
So that goes back to what I was saying earlier around having a conversation with your manager that the work that you're doing around diversity and inclusion shouldn't be seen as extra and it shouldn't be seen as not part of your job. So when you talk about like developing yourself professionally, you're talking about developing yourself both on the soft skills side, which is a lot of the work around diversity and inclusion, and also on your technical, like your hard skills side, right? This is the work that you need to do to develop yourself in your other responsibilities. But you're doing work across both of these different spectrums to help the company as a whole. Right? And so that's how I think you have that conversation to allocate your time appropriately so that it doesn't feel like you're doing all of this extra stuff and not growing in one area versus the other. Does that make sense? Okay, so the question is, give an example of how employee resource groups can be seen as professional development. So if employee resource groups are truly aligned to your business priorities, that should be visible to the rest of the company. And there should be executive sponsorship behind that. So once you have those 2 things in place, then it's actually very easy to talk about how employee resource groups benefit the company. And part of that benefit is becoming a business resource for the company, where you are working on professional development of your employees to retain and engage them, right? And so it's really about doing that. I think sharing some examples at other companies as well, so get connected to other ERGs where they are doing that kind of work and positioning themselves as professional development. That should always be part of your recruiting. That should always be part of your communications around the ERG.
Hi, you talked a lot about, or everybody's been talking about the Rooney Rule and implementing that, and this is actually the first time I heard you say that it was not successful. Were you able to combine that with other kind of cultural transformation? I think you said it was the right practice to actually get that to work, or do you think that just will not be successful?
No, actually I do think that it will work, but in the broader context of doing the cultural change, right? So don't just implement the Rooney Rule by itself and think that, oh, okay, if we do this, everything will change. It's all about how do you look at all these different aspects of what goes into hiring a candidate that you need to really re-examine and reassess. So as I mentioned earlier, it's about, okay, looking at the job description, looking at who's interviewing, like the types of interview questions that you ask, what are the screeners that you put people through, right? And recognizing whether there are some biased assumptions around that are preventing more diverse candidates from applying and being considered for that role. So in the context, if you do all of these different things, then I think the Rooney Rule is really powerful.
Cool. Hi. At a few other presentations at this conference, I've heard people say that when you're trying to make the case to executives for doing more diversity programs, that actually you don't use the emotional part at all. It's all about making the business case. So I found it really interesting. Like perhaps that's something that varies between companies and sets of execs. Like which part works better? Is the emotional appeal better or the business case? So could you elaborate on like when you were doing this, how did you figure out that actually in your case the emotional part was going to be more effective?
Yeah, so I actually think it's a both and, right? Like you need both to really get it across. And I think you hit on an important point about know your audience. So whoever's in the room that you're presenting to, if they are primarily data-driven, make sure that you cater to that. I have definitely talked to senior leaders who are like, you know what, I don't want to hear the stories, I just want to see the numbers, and go with that, and that's fine, but be prepared for both ways. And for me, like I knew who was going to be in the room, and so I knew that I had both the totally rational type and the very emotional type. But there are people that I had to move forward. And so I tried to make sure that I did my research on the audience ahead of time to make sure that I presented the right points and case studies to really start to move them forward.
Let's give a big applause to Cynthia Owyoung. Thank you so much.